Welcome to the Tactical Cyber Podcast, where we transform strategic cyber insights into actionable tactics for everyday implementation. Join your hosts, retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Darren Mott and Risk Advisory Practice Leader at Warren Averett, Paul Perry. Together, they bring decades of experience from the front lines of cybersecurity and risk management to help business owners and individuals take the actions that will keep their business and personal digital data safe. Each episode, we delve into the world of cybersecurity, sharing real-world experiences, expert interviews, and practical tips to safeguard your digital landscape. It's time to move past cyber strategies and start working cyber tactics.
Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the Tactical Cyber Podcast. I am your host, retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Darren Mott, and clearly still StreamYard novice because I screwed up the intro again, but hopefully you may not have caught that. So if you did, well, it is what it is. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you didn't see it, so you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, but I goofed up the intro again, so that was some good times. So let me bring in my co-host, Paul Perry of Warren Averett. Paul, hello.
What's up, Darren? Good to see you. Glad to be here.
At some point, I will have this figured. And actually, that's an interesting technical question. Are you still getting the feedback on your end, or does it sound better this week?
It sounds better this week. There may still be a delay, but I don't hear any of the feedback.
Oh, that's good. All right. Well, that's a thumbs up. So this episode, we are going to be joined in a few minutes by Justin Headley, also of Warren Averett, talk about the top 10 cyber deficiencies most businesses kind of get into from a compliance standpoint. We'll talk to him what those are and hopefully how to mitigate them and do the tactical things so that you no longer have those deficiencies. But before to get to that, let me bring up our news articles of the week because obviously, as you may well know, as I mentioned every time, I also do a cyber news podcast, and so I feel the obligation to continue to talk news stuff because the cybercrime problem is clearly not fixing itself anytime soon. So, Paul, this was your article, the hack of the National Public Data Database. So go ahead.
And I think to your point, Darren, about news, one of the things when I'm talking to folks is they always look at articles and then they pass them by. It's only you and I and everybody else that's listening to this podcast that actually listen to and read news articles to understand what happened, how it happened, what it actually was. I think a lot of people just pass it over. And so I think you making sure we bring up an article and all your other podcasts doing the same thing with the news, I think it's the most important thing we can do so that people understand, don't just bypass the article. There's actually good information in there and you need to read it. And so this one was from Bleeping Computers, and it just talked about 2.7 billion records have been leaked, including social security numbers, including physical addresses, possibly aliases from the National Public Data. I think the important part about reading this article is, look, everybody that's listening to this and beyond, your stuff's out there. You've just got to know that it is. So what does that mean, Paul? What do I do because my information is compromised? It's monitoring everything you have. It's making sure that what's out there on you and the activity from a financial perspective, from a debt perspective, from a social media perspective, is actually you and it's not somebody impersonating you, right? Because they can go and get all this information. That's the biggest piece I see when I'm reading this article is everybody just needs to know your stuff's out there, and you just gotta be vigilant. You've got to take 5 seconds. You've got to think about, okay, do I actually have this card note, or did somebody open this up in my name? Did I actually already do my tax filings, or did somebody do that in my name? And I think with this kind of information, they can do that. And so you've just got to stay vigilant. I think that's the biggest piece I want our listeners to know is stay vigilant with stuff like this.
And it's really something you have to deal with the rest of your lives, right? Because this data now out there, and there's a lot of ways bad guys can use them, not just criminal guys either. I mean, criminal guys like this stuff because they can do fraud and they can do all that other stuff. But the nation state guys like it too because they want to know, who's in the government and what information can we pull from them or in the defense industry so that we can target them for espionage and do all those kind of things. And criminals can take this information, maybe the information stolen here was not all of your personal information, but it's part of it. And then if you look at all the other data breaches that have happened and other pieces of your PII has been stolen, now they can create a huge dossier and basically scam you till the end of time, and you're going to have to deal with this continuously unless you do like you're saying, Paul, right? Stay on top of it, be aware of that. Take a look at your credit ratings regularly. You get 3 free ones a year. Every 4 months you can go to one of the credit bureaus and ask for a free credit report and just see if there's suddenly any credit cards in your name that you didn't expect and things like that. And the funny thing about this article, I've already seen this today, is that appears to be fictitious versions of this being sold on the dark web too. So there's at least some bad guy on bad guy crime going on in the dark web, at least with this data for right now.
I thought there was a trust amongst thieves, Darren. Is that not the case here?
Yeah. Well, here's the other I meant to mention. I guarantee you that National Public Data, right? Is that their name? National Public Data had a privacy page that said, "We take every effort to protect your data." Well, not every effort, clearly. I'm sure they had one of the 10.
Well, and maybe those efforts are something they thought they did a year or 2 or 3 ago, and then they stopped doing it. Right.
They did it.
So hopefully Justin will tell us what some of those things are that companies need to do.
Right. They did it on the day they wrote the policy and published it. They were all over it, doing it all day long on that day, and then it kind of ended after that. So that'd be my guess. All right. So mine is more of a good news story. So this is what I call from the good news file. Police recover $40 million from an international email scam. So this is from Lyon, France. Basically, it's from Interpol. Interpol did an international takedown of a group out of Singapore, I believe, is where the bad guys were. Basically, it was a business email compromise scam. I would take that back. So, there was a commodity firm based in Singapore that filed a police report that they'd fallen victim to a business email compromise scam. This is where they either some bad guys got into their system or sent them a fake invoice. In this case, it appears they got a fake invoice from one of their vendors. And I don't know what this company makes or what they do, but it was a $42 million invoice. And they paid it. And then the company that actually wanted the money said, "Hey, where's our money?" And it turns out it was compromised. But Interpol has something in place similar to what the FBI calls the business email compromise kill chain. And they were able to track where the money was transferred to and basically stop 40 million of it. And then the police in Singapore were actually able to, it was in Timor-Leste is where the money went. So they worked with authorities there. I believe that must be in Africa. I'm guessing that's an African country. I didn't look it up in the map, which would have been good planning for the podcast had I done that, but I did not. But I assume that's where that is. But they ended up arresting 9 people and getting $2 more million back. So thumbs up to Interpol for this. And this is kind of the key here to this is, with business email compromise, you don't hear about it a lot in the news because ransomware gets the headlines. Business email compromise is 30 times more profitable to bad guys than ransomware. So that's why they do it. But if you find out you're the victim of this, then you report it in the U.S. If you report it within 48 hours to the FBI, you have a pretty good chance of getting your money back. And clearly, if it's in overseas in somewhere in an EU associated, Interpol associated country, if you reported them, you might be able to get it back as well. So thumbs up to them.
Absolutely, great job. Need more positive news like this. We don't always see it.
Yep,
I was a victim. 3 months ago, 4 months ago. Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to do the Cyber Smart Morning News update. I'm going to do after this episode. There was an arrest out of the Cleveland division from a Russian guy. So that was another more good news. But that's for a different podcast.
That was your old stomping ground, right?
It was my first squad. Yep, my first squad I ran. I was the supervisor for the cyber squad there in 2009 to 2011. Good times. The only problem with Cleveland is the weather in Cleveland is the problem in Cleveland. So that's the only problem with Cleveland. So let's bring in Justin. Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Welcome to this Tactical Cyber Podcast. I was about to say Cyber Guy Podcast, but that is not where we're at here today.
Thanks, Darren. I appreciate it. Excited to talk about IT controls. Hopefully something that our audience can kind of take away, some good best practices.
So I'll set this up, Darren and Justin, to bring you in on this, and I think it's important that in the first couple episodes we had of the Tactical Cyber Podcast, there was a lot of discussion about what are the things people need to be doing, and I think it's important. And the reason we wanted to kind of dive into this is a lot of organizations get assessments, a lot of organizations get SOC reports, get IT reviews, IT audits, you name it, they get it, right? And I think you see a lot of deficiencies, and you probably see some very similar deficiencies. And so we wanted to kind of just set up this discussion to talk about those deficiencies. But as Darren has mentioned, we'd really like the tactical, practical side. Yes, you had that deficiency, but what is it you can do to make sure that deficiency doesn't happen? But more importantly, whatever that is that you're doing, that remediation is hopefully bettering the cybersecurity of a company. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah. And that's an interesting point you bring up, because so I would just say our group on any given year has these IT control discussions with about 400 or so companies. And through the years, to your point, Paul, we found that honestly, I think regardless of the size of the company or the industry, it's these same overarching issues that rear their ugly head, so to speak, again and again and again. And yes, IT cybersecurity is changing at light speed, it feels like sometimes. But I think while the attack methods might change, strangely enough, some of these foundational issues are the same again and again. And I sort of call these the low-hanging fruit almost, like get your foundation right before trying to dive into the weeds and try to solve the world's issues. So that's kind of where we come from with that.
And when you talk about, when we talk about controls and you talk about assessments or audits, you know, some of this is industry specific, probably. There's probably some differences between the industries that are out there and what they should or shouldn't be doing, or laws within states or whatever that is. And is that an important thing to kind of discuss before you jump into this? Because some of this is probably, people are going, well, there's not a piece of paper that says I need to do that, but they may not be aware. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of things we'll communicate were just general good best practices, right? But if you're in one of those industries like banks, credit unions, anyone in financial services, insurance, you're going to say, hey, these are things that have been communicated, been required of us for years. So it's going to vary per industry. It may not be, hey, on this piece of paper, this regulation is required, but it's going to look a little different. So yeah, that's a great point to kind of preface that.
So why do you think?
Let's
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say,
you go, Darren.
So you said that these are the common. Why do you think it's the common ones? Like, what are we doing wrong?
I think going back to, it's more of a culture issue with organizations, and that's probably an overarching thing, right? It's organizations are not getting some of the basic blocking and tackling right. I think in our minds, when we think about cybersecurity, right, it's this overarching, this very difficult task, and there's no doubt it's difficult to try to keep, it's like drinking from a fire hose trying to understand this. But it's some of this basic blocking and tackling that I think if we get back to the basics, that will really kind of help improve the cyber posture of some organizations.
So start us off. What's the top one? What's the one you see all the time?
So let's start tone at the top right here. So let's just talk about governance for a minute. So there's sort of two sides of the coin with the governance. So it's looking at the leaders, and it's also so on the leader side, oftentimes company leaders, they're just not bought into cybersecurity. And I know this is probably not a groundbreaking thing, right? But what they are saying, what they're saying and what they're doing just doesn't align, right? We sort of see this approach of, we're just going to kind of wait and see, kick the can down the road. We often hear, hey, our company, we're a little fish in a big pond. Hackers aren't targeting us. But the posture that we see and if unfortunately if a company does get breached, it looks very different, right? It's this kick the can, wait and see approach versus it's all hands on deck. Our hairs are on fire. What can we do to do this? So trying to communicate to organizations, like if we can put some resources on the front side of this, it's a whole lot better. And then if you look at on the IT side, the communication with IT and with the company leaders is just lacking. Oftentimes what we see is the only communication that takes place is just one time a year, and they just slide across, here's our massive budget, and the CFO looks at them like they're crazy, and I don't understand, there's no value add here, in trying to help them see that. But some of the best companies that we see has an IT leader that can speak to both sides. And that's a very difficult task, right? That can get into the weeds of IT, but also can speak the speak of company leaders. And oftentimes when we do risk assessments, we're just bridging the gap, right? We're trying to help the leaders see why IT is valued, and help IT kind of use the reports as leverage. So collaboration internally is huge. Where I'm a big proponent of IT having a seat at the table. Technology is going to be involved in almost every decision that a company makes. So understanding, I think, and learning how to have a little bit less tech speak when you're with the company leaders, help them to kind of see how IT sort of fits into the company's goals, the plans, looking to see where that value is is huge, and that kind of helps to improve governance as a whole.
Darren, we were just talking about, we needed a podcast that talked about the resources, right? Like,
yeah, right, exactly.
The right resources, and not trying to wait for somebody that's done it for 15 years. There's good folks that have been doing it for several years. And so I think that's a future podcast, but I think that's what Justin's speaking to.
Well, I think the other issue is like you're talking IT, right? But IT and cybersecurity are not the same things. I work in a cybersecurity environment where cybersecurity is the main thing, and our biggest, well, not our biggest, but an adversaries are IT folks, because there's more of this and not as much as this. There needs to be more blending together of understanding what everybody's needs and requirements are, but how do we make them work, right? I understand as an IT guy, you want the network to be, up and running and not have downtime. But as a cybersecurity guy, you want to make sure that the bad guys aren't getting in and that we're not leaking data all over the place. And sometimes those two things just don't align to each other.
For sure. And you could have said that better, Darren. I mean, I would almost say the overarching word of this is collaboration. It is so lacking in every piece of IT. So I totally agree there.
I think that's a leadership problem too, right?
For sure. Yeah. That's right. The second thing I'll hit on here is third-party risk management. It's everyone's favorite topic. Vendor management, third-party risk management. It continues to be a hot button topic, but companies continue to outsource critical functions, critical services, and we continue to see that there's this assumption that controls are in place, that, hey, if I'm signing on this large company to do this service or this function, that I can just assume that they're going to do it well. That's kind of out of sight, out of mind, so to speak, right? And there's this false sense of security there. Also with these large cloud storage providers, Azure, AWS, and what we see is, because there's a big name, there's this assumption that, hey, everything's taken care of from a security standpoint. I don't have to manage user access. I don't have to do any pen testing or things like that. Again, just this check the box. It's out of sight, out of mind. But with vendor management, we can outsource that service. We can outsource a function. We can't outsource that responsibility. If you have a vendor of yours that is breached and it causes your customers to have some data leakage, that responsibility is going to sit squarely on your shoulders. The customers are going to look at you and they're going to say, hey, why did my information get leaked? And they're going to look at you, not the vendor. And that's a tough conversation to have. There's no doubt.
Unless you're Snowflake, then you're just going to say, well, you didn't have multi-factor authentication turned on, so it's your fault.
There's always that, right?
There's always a finger pointing back.
Yeah. So I think the fix here is, number one, we've got to understand who our vendors are. And this is a tough exercise at first across organizations, because you've got these shadow IT vendors, right? And it's like, wow, this is a very terrible exercise. I didn't realize we're doing business with this vendor that has terrible controls in place. But once you kind of understand who your vendors are, you got to make sure you have regular touch points with those vendors, reviewing SOC reports, just some way to understand what their security posture is. And unfortunately, IT is often the scapegoat for third-party risk management. It's like, hey, if the vendor has access to our systems, then IT has to do all that. But it kind of takes it takes an enterprise-wide approach. You need someone from legal and operations and someone with a financial background to kind of understand what the whole risk is with the vendor. And then finally, it can't be a set it and forget it. We've got to have ongoing monitoring. Your controls are always changing, so the vendor's controls are always going to be changing. So we've got to make sure that periodically we're just having touch points with vendors, understanding if the risk has changed, and we're kind of assessing and readjusting our risk profile, so to speak. So the third thing I'll kind of touch on here is
starting to sound.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's sorry, Justin. It's starting to sound like the cyber problems are all IT's fault. Right?
It's common, right? I mean, I think it's there's often this.
But how many?
Yeah.
Sorry, how many companies are IT and cyber, or I should say IT and truly security is the same person, and how many companies is it separate?
Yeah, I mean
that probably plays into both of those issues.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that goes back to the talent shortage we have. You've got one IT guy that. And this is obviously going to vary a lot depending on the organization you're dealing with, but so often you've got you've got IT people wearing multiple different hats on any given day, and you ask them about, how's your security monitoring look like that? And they're like, I haven't had a chance to do that. I've been resetting passwords and dealing with HR and setting up people. I mean, so they're wearing so many different hats that oftentimes, like, security and compliance are going to be two different things, right? So I mean, we're not thinking about security. We're just thinking about just operations, how to get through our day, so to speak. So it's going to look very different. That's a great point. So moving on, another one of everyone's favorite topic is security awareness training, and everyone loves the good annual security awareness training videos or emails, whatever the case is. But not to beat a dead horse here, but I mean, employees are still one of our biggest vulnerabilities. Darren, to your point earlier, business email compromise is out there. I think the IC3 tells us that it's among the top as far as out there, and number two, yeah. So those are out there, and we've seen this big push now that with AI and with chatbots that hackers that maybe that English is not their first language, it's not their native language. They're using chatbots to craft these fantastic looking emails that will make you think twice before clicking, right? So companies are traditionally just taking this approach of, we're going to send out this annual video, and or either we're going to send out a quarterly email, and we just kind of hope for the best. And everyone learns differently with security awareness, or just in general. But what we've seen is that companies that take more of a hands-on approach with training, things like social engineering, phishing emails, where they're sending emails out periodically and training, putting your feet to the fire. Do you understand? Can you spot these phishing emails? And having some soft repercussions, I'll call them, right? Of, if you click on this, you got to go through remedial training. If you do it 2 or 3 times, it's a separate conversation, so to speak. That looks different than just, here's your annual video, and I hope you watched it, and we'll see you again next year. So to me, that's taking more of a hands-on approach is what we see separates the good from great companies and with security awareness training for their employees.
I actually argue it needs to be more than once a year. You need to have something at least twice a month. It doesn't have to be long. Just have a topic, have a business topic on the first Wednesday of the month and a personal topic on the second Wednesday of the month. And it can be, you can just have the same ones every month, not every month, but like every January, it's these 2, every February. Maybe that gets old, but there's plenty of people willing to create content to do that. And it doesn't have to be, you're going to spend an hour watching a PowerPoint. And then, in the FBI, we had our annual training. I remember the first 4 years I was in there, it was, how fast can I zip through this PowerPoint? And then you'd get a certificate that said you passed information security training. It took you 3 minutes, 42 seconds. So come on.
Yeah. Check the box and we're
proudly
there.
Proudly post it on the pod.
Yeah, that's right. But no, I totally agree, Darren. I think anytime you can kind of break those up into smaller bite-sized portions, whether it's email testing training, whether it's just these little quick tidbits, right? Instead of just doing it one time a year, it's always changing. There's always something you can push out. So that's key there.
Well, and I think that's what people like Matt Lee and Darren Mott are trying to do on a regular basis with these podcasts that are let's talk about the news. It's those little bit pieces that people can ingest all the time. And I'm promoting you, Darren, because I think people need to do self-education more often. And as a culture of an organization, you have to push that. But it's these podcasts, it's these article readings, it's all of that kind of stuff. That in itself is security awareness training. Mm-hmm. You may not get to sign off and check a box for it, but if I'm getting my people to change the way they do it and do it often, then hopefully they're getting better at it going forward. Do you agree?
Yeah, not that Scott Angenbaum needs more publicity, but his whole thing is cyber.
Right.
His whole
Scott,
thing is, his whole thing is
cyber.
His whole thing
I specifically left Scott off because he doesn't need any help.
But his whole thing is cyber secure mindset, and that's right. I mean, if you just say, look, here's a cyber threat against your kids. Well, it's not going to protect your business, but it's going to get people thinking about cyber threats. At least have it in the front of their mind so they can say, okay, I got to, at least I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because I think it's so often we divide the two, but I mean, having that mindset as a whole that's huge. Yep. All right, moving on. So the next couple is kind of falls into this logical access bucket. It's just an area that companies just do poorly. We take a set and forget approach with logical access. So thinking about our applications and our systems and the cloud applications we have, they all probably are going to have some type of sensitive data, some PHI, PII, and who we give access to these systems. We give and we give and we give. We never take a step back and say, hey, does this still make sense? Is this still appropriate? And this is another area that unfortunately just falls on IT. And a lot of times the line of business is the one should be taking the primary responsibility of saying, these are our applications. Are the people in here, do they have the right level of access? Does it sort of align with their job duties? And then just over time, what you have is just you have these Frankenstein type roles, these custom roles where everyone either has like just admin rights or super user rights, and that increases your compromise footprint, your attack surface exponentially, because you've got the ability for any one user to be compromised and have too much access within the system. So sort of the fix here, and I'm not going to dive into zero trust a lot. I know you guys had a previous guest that was fantastic on that, but essentially that, everyone in or outside the system has to be verified at all times. Fantastic way to think about from a logical access standpoint. That can be very costly, obviously, but also another way you can think about this is just to have good role-based access. So defining where those buckets are that everyone sort of fits in, and kind of thinking about that through the lens of the principle of least privilege. So only giving access to exactly what you need. And you have these defined buckets where everyone is in there. And then finally, just sort of as a good detective control, it's just maybe once a quarter or twice a year, pulling the user listings, getting the line of business involved, because they're going to know who has access, who's going to need access to these roles, and just taking a step back and saying, hey, does this make sense? Do we need to kind of tweak any of this? Do we have any issues where, like segregation of duties? Anyone have too much access within the systems? Doing that periodically is huge.
Delete your users when they quit.
Which is a fantastic segue, Darren. I know you're going to have my list, but number 5, user deprovisioning. This is an area that just is mind blowing to me. And this is probably, I would say this is a deficiency in at least 90% of our IT audits. It may be more, but companies just do a bad job of just removing people from their systems. And again, it's mind blowing. But if you go back to collaboration, communication, the communication between HR and IT is it's poor, right? So, HR is communicating these things sometimes through phone calls, these one-off emails, and IT's already overloaded. Things get missed, and terminated users are still active within the systems. You also have to think about your third parties. So often we pull user listings and see third-party vendors that have full domain admin rights, and we ask about them. And it's like, yeah, that was a vendor we used 3-4 years ago, so we should probably remove him. I'm like, yeah, you should. So just making sure that you have good communication methods, whether that's a ticket, a formal ticket that HR communicates and it gives a work item to IT. Certainly not, cost efficient, but if you have automated deprovisioning systems where it's tied to HR, your payroll systems, that just kind of helps eliminate some of these one-off issues, and there's like a formal process there. One thing that we advocate is just when you're doing the user access reviews, just, once or twice a year, pull a payroll report, get HR to send you a list of everybody that's on payroll, and just use a simple Excel formula to compare like Active Directory in a payroll report, and that helps tremendously. So again, that's it's an area we see in a lot of audits, and it is mind blowing that people will leave terminated users still active in their systems. If there's someone I don't want access to my systems outside of hackers, right? It's terminated people that potentially could be disgruntled. So making sure we shore up those areas is huge, and an area we see a lot.
So how many of these 10, and I haven't seen your list, obviously, as you said, how many of them are a result of having no policies in place to do them, and how many of them could be fixed if they had actual policies that they followed and mandated and did all the right things for?
That's a good question, and it's another one I have it's number 9 for me, actually.
Okay,
but
sorry, I'm getting my bad.
Darren's reading my mail, I think. Or seeing my, so, but
I have tools.
I'm going to pop ahead to that one because that's a great point, Darren. So with policies, as an auditor, I love good documentation, right? And I can appreciate a good policy. I'm not ever gonna argue if anyone has like good policies and procedures, but I'm not gonna go where you think I am with policies and procedures. Yes, policies and procedures are very important to making sure that your team is aligned, everyone's on the same page, especially for small companies. We often see small companies where you've got one or two people that's been there 10, 15, 20 years and they've got all this head knowledge, right? Making sure that's transferred to paper. But the approach I'm going to take with policies and procedures is that I'm going to preface that if you have to pick a side, making sure that you are good, you are sound procedurally, you've got good practices in place is way more important than spending too much time kind of documenting policies on paper, right? If you have to decide whether to have policies or to be sound, I'll always go with sound procedures, right? I can't overstate that. Mm-hmm. Far too often what we see is that companies either have little to no policies or they have this formal grandiose policy and they're not doing anything in there. As an auditor, I would rather you have, be solid in practice than, get caught with your pants down, so to speak, by saying we're doing all this stuff and you're not doing any of it. So if you're going to have policies, make sure that they're aligned with what you're actually doing. And I don't know if that answers your question there, but I would probably.
It's a fine line. It's a fine line, right? I mean, if you have a 45-page policy document on email, there's no way you're going to. If an auditor comes in and says, "Show me how you're doing all this stuff," no, they're not doing all this stuff. But if they at least have, like you said, have just a standard procedure. We want to do these. We want to do these things. Boom, knock them out. Plenty of companies write tremendously fantastic policies that no one can possibly read. It's like the user policy when you download a video game, right? You have to go through EA Sports thing for NCAA football 2025. I'm sure it says in there somewhere, if you have a grandchild, your first child must be named the first name of the guy who programmed the game, probably. But I didn't see it because I didn't pay attention to it. But so I mean, you got to figure out what works, get you through your governance correctly, but also does the job you need to do. That's my take on it anyway.
For sure. Nah,
I would say that people are, when earlier you talked about people not having enough time to do certain things, sitting down and writing is probably not the top of their list. And I say writing a policy, you can also write a procedure, which should be shorter, but you're right. Who's going to read 45 pages? It's got to be succinct. It's got to be doable.
No, for sure. Make sure, again, going back to make sure you've got your foundation in place. Policies are nice to have. But if you're going to put it on paper, by God, please do it, right? You don't want to get caught there. So I'll always be thinking about that. All right, moving on.
So we skipped to number 9.
What do
we got to go back to what, number 6? We got to go back to number 6?
Should I guess it? Want me to guess it?
You've been on a roll here, so
well, no multi-factor authentication. I'm gonna say no multi-factor authentication across all systems.
It's authentication and multi-factor authentication is pretty funny. So this seems like a no-brainer, right? That we need to have strong, complex passwords, but we're going to communicate it anyway. But we see it often that there's still a lot of organizations that don't have multi-factor authentication or good complex passwords for their systems or for remote access. And the most common complaint we get is that this is often very an interesting complaint in healthcare, but I just don't want to fight the battle. I just rather not do that, right? And that probably goes most often to some of these industries that are not as regulated, but they just don't want to fight the battle. It's like if we go from 8 to 10 characters, then all I'm going to hear is just complaints for the next 3 months, right? But and there's a lot of battle on the schools of thought of what your password should be. Is it expiration? Is it non-expiring with a number of characters? Microsoft is trying to kill off the password versus NIST is the non-expiring. What I would say there is just find what best fits your company's profile. What do you have in your systems? What is your risk profile? What data do you have? And just find what makes sense and just stick to it. And just also make sure that to consider that if you are highly regulated, like I mentioned, that if there's any best practices they provide, if you need to follow NIST or something like that, align to those systems. But that's sort of again, seems like a no-brainer, but I think it's important to recommend and important to restate because it is a deficiency that we see often in IT audits. Anything to add there, Darren?
No, you're right on. I got nothing to add for that. I'm going to guess the next one is
right.
No incident response plan. Is that next?
This is getting good.
Well, I went to ChatGPT and said, give me Justin Headley's top 10 cyber deficiencies for businesses.
Okay. All right. So it seems like maybe I have some data leakage or something. So yeah, incident response. We see this a ton that I would say that a lot of organizations still have incident response baked into like disaster recovery business continuity. Incident response to business continuity is very different. How you are going to respond to an incident looks very different than how you're going to respond to a natural disaster. But we still see a lot of companies just kind of marry the two. And then what we see is that if an organization does have an incident response plan, what they're leaning on is that it's very like legally heavy, right? That they're aligning themselves with these, the state breach notifications and the statutes and the notification requirements, things like that, which are very important. But it's not response driven of how do we actually respond if we had an incident. And I always use this quote when I'm talking about incident response plans, and it's fantastic from Mike Tyson, but everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. So if you've got these plans, you've got to make sure that you're testing them. Look at your plans, go through a scenario, just through a tabletop exercise, do this, at least once a year. And this is another fantastic opportunity to involve the leaders of an organization right through this tabletop exercise. And we've had the opportunity to sit in a few of these, and it's always so intriguing that there's like these light bulb moments, so to speak, of, when you're going through this scenario and these steps, it's like, wow, if this happened, we're kind of up the creek without a plan here, right? So it's very important to just get around a table periodically, go through a scenario, walk through this incident response plan, and you're going to get a lot of great ideas. And again, it's another way to collaborate with the rest of the organization outside of IT to making sure that we're on the same page there.
Or patching.
I actually don't have patching on the list.
All right.
I've got it under the umbrella of vulnerability management, so you could probably call it patching there. But so with vulnerability management, this is probably just a plug for the all the IoT devices we have out there. But man, we have tons of things connected to our networks. 5 to 10 years ago, we're just thinking about our laptops and our servers and our workstations. But I mean, now we're talking about TVs and thermostats and appliances. And we think about that just personally, but this is happening in your organizations as well. And thinking about our friends like in manufacturing, all those IoT devices that are monitoring compliance and performance on the assembly line. And also thinking about our friends in healthcare, all of those patient connected vital monitoring devices, those health monitoring devices, they all have operating systems that are constantly updating. So we have to make sure we're identifying those and we're patching those. All those have vulnerabilities. And a good plug here is that you can't protect what you don't know about. So your asset inventory has to be accurate. The scope that you're looking at there has to be accurate. Make sure that you're running vulnerability scans periodically. All those, like I mentioned, all the operating systems out there on all these devices, not just your workstations, your endpoints, all of these are constantly updating. So having a good vulnerability scan program that identifies those and kind of feeds into, to Darren's point, patch management, making sure all of that's updating periodically, that's huge and that's key. And then the third thing there, vulnerability management, is just either whether you're doing this internally, we would prefer it to be externally, but have a pen test done periodically, internally and externally, just understand where your exploits are. You would much rather a white hat pen tester find your vulnerabilities than someone with malicious intent. So understand where your exploits are and just make sure you're passing them periodically. So we covered number 9, just around our policies and procedures and our thoughts there. The last thing I want to leave you with is just general security monitoring. And
that was going to be my guess.
Was it going to be? I forgot to go to you to see if you could guess it there. See how good the chat bots were. But it's a very popular strategy, I think, in cybersecurity is that, and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of fantastic vendors out there that have great tools, but there are no silver bullets in cybersecurity. So often we see in IT audits is that there's this strategy, so to speak, that, and sometimes this is driven from the company leaders of like, if we could get that whatever that tool is, that latest greatest tool is going to solve all of our issues. And so often what we see is that if organizations would just use the tools they had in place, it would be so much better than trying to find the latest greatest bolt-on application to our network, right? And you kind of, in lieu of using that other bolt-on gadget, use what you have, utilize the logging out of that. Really work with the configuring of those systems to kind of match your risk appetite, because man, those systems will spit out some logs. But kind of understanding what those are, I would rather you spend your money on things like log aggregation tools to help you make sense of these piles of logs that you have out there. And what we've seen kind of a good to great IT practices is that they've really defined and kind of tailored those systems to know that if we're seeing an alert, then we need to respond to it. And a lot of times it's there's a lot of noise on these systems. And again, going back to IT, people are just overloaded. They're not really sure what to listen to. So just a plug there for when you're monitoring, use what you have first. Sometimes there is a need for other bolt-on tools, but use what you have first and really configure those and kind of dial those in to kind of understanding where your risk is out there.
And that's hard, right? Because if your person is just the IT and the cyber person, he's got no time to read logs to figure out who's doing bad stuff on the network. And then so you're going to offload it to your third party who may be bad at cyber. So increase your third party management. So it's a continuing cycle. But yeah. Paul?
Yeah, this is, what's interesting is the 10 things Justin talked about and the fact that Darren could depict those out. I think the biggest piece is, and Justin, you may be able to speak to this, people think they're alone in not being prepared, or they're alone in what they're doing from a control or not doing from a controls perspective. But there's a lot of people doing it. It's all the same stuff. And I think if you went and you found 10 other auditors, they would come up with at least 80% of your list, right? I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I think even like I mentioned before, I mean, if we had to go back and have this conversation 5 years ago, again, the attack methods change, but we would have been having the same type conversations, right? It does change, there's no doubt, but getting our basic blocking and tackling, our foundation here is huge to kind of helping understand and solve some of these issues.
So Justin, if people have questions after this, how can they contact you? Or can they contact you, or do you want me to contact me and then I'll contact you?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. It's my first and last name at warrenaverett.com. Happy to answer any questions and have a conversation, because again, like to Paul's point, you do feel sometimes alone out there, and you feel like maybe your situation is super unique and trying to understand and solve some of these things. But yeah, I'm happy to have any conversations or any questions anyone has. Happy to talk to those.
And would you agree, or I guess I'll ask a question, for small and medium businesses, they can do all these things, right? It's not impossible to do these things. It's just finding someone to help you do them.
That's a good point. I would say sometimes it's a little overwhelming trying to think about putting all these IT controls in place, and it's like eating an elephant, right? But if you could find a third-party provider to either kind of help you outsource some of these controls, or if it's more of, I don't know where I'm at, I don't know where to get started, finding a third-party provider to sort of risk assess and say, hey, you've got these 10 things you need to worry about, 10, 15 items, but here are the lows that you can kind of kick the can down the road. Here are the things you probably need to address today. This is a huge a risk that you need to address like day one, because man, hackers could really take advantage of this. So finding a third-party provider to kind of help you understand some of those things and simplify some of it is huge.
So of those 10, what are the top 3 a company should at least start with? Like if let's say someone says, I'm not doing any of those things, what 3 should they start with? If you were the consultant, what would you say? Do these 3 first, and we'll worry about the other 7.
Yeah, no doubt. So the first one, I'd say we all have employees, right? Regardless of the size. Start with security awareness training. all your employees they're on the front line, so to speak. They're getting these emails on a daily basis. So start with training your employees. There are some of these phishing programs out there have a low cost per year, right? There's not a huge dollar outlay. So start with training your employees. The second thing I'd say is we all have systems out there that to some extent have sensitive data. Make sure that you've got those locked down. Make sure that you've got a good understanding of who has access to your systems, whether that's internal people or external people. And then the third thing I'd probably say is just it's not a matter of if, it's when with incident response. So understand, get your organization on the same page of if this happens, this is our plan to respond. This is how we're going to handle this. And whether that's, we could do that internally or we need a third party to sort of help with that. Make sure that you're on the same page with incident response, because again, it's not a matter of if, it's when. And if we could have a plan to respond, we're going to be better for it.
And I would say to add to number 2 would be multi-factor authentication. That's part of locking the systems down. Right. I mean, that's one that, Darren, you were in the FBI and you ran cyber. How many of those cases did you work where multi-factor authentication would have stopped it?
All of them.
Yeah. That logical access in that nutshell is huge, whether that's authentication or who has access to your systems. I couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, Justin, thanks so much.
Well, Justin,
Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you coming on and talking through this, and appreciate your insight for folks.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm always happy to have the conversation. I think the more often that we as a cyber community can sort of come together and discuss these things, it helps us all as a whole, as the cyber community as a whole. So I appreciate the opportunity. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, sir. All right, Paul, what do you got going on this week? Where can people find you? You speaking anywhere?
Actually, yeah, I'm headed to Louisiana tomorrow for a conference down to do a cybersecurity and AI discussion, talking about what AI is and is not, and how it is impacting cybersecurity, but how it is creating another vulnerability for companies, I think, is the biggest piece. So yeah, I get to do that on Thursday, a couple other meetings throughout, but that's what I've got going on. What about you?
I got a little podcast tomorrow with Corey Munson on PC Matic about my book, which I haven't printed yet, but
awesome.
Get Cyber Smart, a user-friendly guide.
Yeah, hold it up.
So on and so forth. Yes. So I have your copy here. So next time you're in Huntsville, we'll play pickleball and I'll give you a copy. So we'll do that way. So
sounds good to me, sir. Always appreciate it. And thanks to all the listeners out there.
All right, Paul, thanks so much. And we'll talk soon. Thank you all for taking the time to download, listen, watch the podcast on replay on LinkedIn or on YouTube. As you go through your week, know that knowledge is protection. If we understand the threats targeting us, we can assess our risk, proceed wisely. As always, thanks so much for taking the time to download and listen to the podcast and all our other podcasts, Paul's podcast, my other podcast. If you have questions, thoughts, or comments, ideas for future show episodes, email me right there, Darren at thecyberguy.com, cyber spelled CYBUR. We will catch you again next time.
Thank you for listening to the Tactical Cyber Podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of their respective employers. If you have thoughts, comments, or suggestions on the Tactical Cyber Podcast, email Darren at thecyberguy.com. You can also follow Darren and Paul on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Darren Mott or linkedin.com/in/Paul M. Perry CPA. Paul Perry is a member of Warren Averett CPAs and Advisors, where he leads the firm's risk advisory and assurance services team, a group dedicated to optimizing businesses' financial, operational, and technology controls so that organizations can make strategic choices for sustained growth. Learn more at warrenaverett.com. Stay safe, stay secure, and we'll see you next time.